Arthur Bucco is a warm and convivial host, Elmer Fudd's personal hero, and a world-renowned sex coach.
Oh, she likes it when you rub her muzzle.
However, had things gone a little bit differently, due to similar personality traits, he would have likely closely resembled other characters from the show. If he had joined the mob, he would have been a lot like Junior. If he had joined the police, he would have been like Vin Bakazian. If he weren't so lucky, he would have been David Scatino. And if he was on Seinfeld, he would be George Costanza, who also goes by the name Art and would do much better with the ladies if only he still had his hair.
Maury's wigs don't come off!
But, along with Adriana, Artie seems to generate the most argument among viewers as to whether or not he's a good person. So, in this episode here on Bully Whispers, we will be evaluating many aspects of Artie Bucco, including his relationship with Tony and whether or not it was a good thing, his relationship with Charmaine and his penchant for hostesses, where we will take a look into his relationships with Adriana, Elody, and Martina, his seeming desire to enter the underworld, and ultimately whether or not he was a good guy. From the very first scene, Charmaine is visibly upset at Tony's mere presence, and she's painted as somewhat of a shrew throughout the early part of the series. In actuality, Artie was very lucky to have her, as she's arguably the best wife in the series along with Gabby Dante. Alongside that, she's also arguably one of the main factors that kept Artie from being David Scatino, with the other being his relationship with Tony, and this is where things start to get interesting. For the majority of the series, Artie is very lucky to be so close with Tony. Tony keeps him out of trouble when he picks fights with made guys, and when things go wrong in his attempt to enter the underworld. However, to start the series, this is not the case, as we see with the bombing of his restaurant, and it's arguable that Artie's obvious desire to dip his toe into the gangster lifestyle is because of his relationship with Tony. Personally, while I think there is some truth there because his proximity to Tony makes it all seem more attainable than it is, I don't think it's a simple one-to-one. Even if Tony wasn't a gangster, Artie still grew up in a mob neighborhood, during the heyday of the mob, was friends with all those same guys, and apparently was the worst of the bunch, so that desire would probably still be in him to some degree. Either way, the impression of Artie we are left with through the first part of the series is one of a nice guy, whose wife constantly nags him, was the victim of a childhood friend, and first impressions usually go a long way. Apparently from here, Artie begins to descend into his midlife crisis. Now I say apparently from here because for all we know he's been crushing on hostesses since before the series started, but I think it's safe to assume it started with Adriana, and it's easy to see why. Ade is smoking hot, not to mention a total sweetheart, and considering the general impression the audience had of Charmaine at that point, combined with the fact that they had broken up, many viewers gave Artie a pass for this one. Now, there are a few things to keep in mind when looking at the great Adriana Debacle. First, even before the awkward date, a drunken Artie picks a fight with Christopher, very clearly over her, and gets away with it due to his friendship with Tony, which is a dynamic we see throughout the series. When it comes to Artie and Adriana specifically, Artie was never the happiest guy, but it's clear that he takes a downward turn when Ade tells him she's leaving her job. After this, Artie has his fight with Chris, and even after being warned not to even speak of it again, he proceeds to take Adriana out on what he hoped would essentially be a date. During this dinner, there are two things worth noting, and one is that this is the first appearance of Artie's earring, which is basically the symbol of his midlife crisis. The other is how obviously uncomfortable he is making her, and this is something we'll see again. I mean, at this point, she looks like she would be willing to give Silvio a call for a ride home. Now, it's important to note here that while the Adriana situation is clearly what got the ball rolling, the fight that prompted the breakup with Charmaine was over Artie going into business with Tony, and she was completely right in saying it was a bad idea, despite Artie's ingenious marketing insights.
Product brandings, beginning with the letter V, make people think of vagina. It's a turnoff.
Well, that would explain why the first time we see Junior he's eating there, and why they changed the name after the fire. It's all starting to come together now. From here, we move on to the situation with Artie's next hostess, Elodie, where we really start seeing how naive Artie actually is. Where George Costanza went to feel her material, Artie went straight for the skin with her ear, which she very clearly doesn't like. He should have went for her muzzle. Now, it's important to note here that she did flirt with him heavily, of course only for the purpose of scamming him, but nevertheless this wasn't some out-of-the-blue advance. Of course, Charmaine sees right through this.
What do you think? She suddenly wants to play hide the boo damn blank with you?
But at this point, they are separated, so she has no real influence on him, which leaves Tony as the primary influence in his life, and that brings us to his deal with Jean-Philippe. I'm sure I'm going to get some pushback for this in the comments, but I think this is yet another instance where Artie is very lucky to be friends with Tony, despite the fact that Tony was the one who lent him the money, and here's why. I generally don't support this line of logic when it comes to justification, but in this case, if it hadn't been for Tony, he would have gotten the money from Ralphie. Remember, Artie went to Ralphie first, and the only reason Ralph said no is because Artie was so close to Tony.
Why not?
Because if you don't pay me back, I ain't gonna be able to hurt you.
Remove that relationship from the picture, and Artie gets the money from Ralph. As it happened, he got it from Tony, and surprise, surprise, he got scammed. Now, during the build-up to his attempt to confront Jean-Philippe, there is one thing I couldn't help but notice. Perhaps he's so used to seeing people immediately back down with Tony and the guys that he thought Jean-Philippe would do the same, but he never seemed to think Jean-Philippe would actually fight back. He thought he would just cave.
Stand up, you frog-eating fudge-to-gods. I will fuck you up, man.
Either way, Artie got himself all worked up and headed over to confront Jean-Philippe.
Psycho killer!
Qu'est-ce que c'est?
Unfortunately, Jean-Philippe learned to fight in La Resistance, so it did not go well for Artie. If only he still had his hair, Jean-Philippe wouldn't have grabbed his earring, ripped it out, and sent him packing. Now, had Artie gotten that money from Ralph, he would have been screwed. Ralphie wouldn't care about Jean-Philippe or go after him, because Ralphie didn't lend Jean-Philippe money. He lent Artie money. Best case scenario for Artie, Ralphie only takes his restaurant and not his kneecaps. But with Tony, he's bailed out yet again when Tony takes over the debt and sends Furio to collect.
So I die. La resistance lives on.
From here, we move on to his relationship with Martina, and with her, he is clearly just perving. Between finding her an apartment, calling in favors for a green card, and teaching her how to drive,
I stopped short.
he appears to just be simping. After all, we never see her flirting with him, and she even flirts with Benny in front of him. Now, to be fair, unlike with Adriana or Elodie, we never see Artie flirting with Martina either. This could be a case of impressions going the long way. We are so used to seeing Artie go after hostesses that we assume he did here, but I mean, come on. No man in their 40s is going to do all of that for a girl in her early 20s because he just wants to be friends. After he realized it wasn't going to happen, he started being mean to her, she helped Benny scam the restaurant, and the ensuing fight with Benny cost him his hand modeling career. He could have been the next Ray McKigney. This episode, Luxury Lounge, is arguably the most significant in the entire series for Artie, and in many ways is a microcosm for Artie's story as a whole. His restaurant is in trouble, he gets rejected by a younger woman, he's screwed over by a gangster, and Tony bails him out of yet another pinch, but we also see the beginning of his comeback story, so to speak, most notably in 3 scenes. Immediately after realizing it was never going to happen with Martina, Artie goes to the Bing, and the conversation that he has with Tony shows that he's starting to accept who he is.
You could fuck her. It's funny, because guys like me, we come here, we get drunk and stare.
Listen, you want to fuck her so bad, I'm sure it could be worked out.
Nah, I couldn't. But you.
While this may superficially appear to be him being depressed because he can't get girls like Tony does, it's not. They are at the Bing, and that is Tony Soprano. If he says something can probably be worked out, then something probably can be worked out, and if Artie wanted to, he could have hooked up with her. Artie's comment of, "No, I couldn't, but you," is his coming to the realization that he isn't like Tony and never will be. In the very next scene, he seems much closer to Charmaine than he has pretty much the entire series. Sure, they have their argument, but there is an affection there between them that we have never really seen before. The Sopranos rarely have multiple scenes in a row focusing on a character that isn't a soprano, so the fact that these 3 were in a row seems quite significant, and of course the episode ends with Artie rediscovering his dad's old recipe book. To end the series, Artie's restaurant is doing better, and he even has the Jets head coach eating there. So, was Artie a good guy or not? Obviously, good and bad exist in a spectrum, and I think he belongs more on the good side than the bad, even without resetting any moral compass due to the other characters. Sure, he did some stupid things, and that's not to be ignored, but in the end he seems to have come around. The main person impacted through all Artie's actions was Charmaine, and if she can forgive him, then who are we to hold a grudge? Well, thanks for watching another episode here on Bully Whispers. As always, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you at the next score.